Good evening. I look a little informal because we got to the airport and said, "Did you pack the jacket?" And no, nobody packed it. It's on our kitchen table. So I thought, what the heck, I'm a writer. I'll just look poetic for you tonight. It is true that I was born in Tijuana. My dad was Mexican. My mom was American. But in some sense, it's a homecoming for me to be in the South. We just left Richmond, Virginia, where I did the Junior League of Richmond literary event, which was, as I was telling somebody earlier, it was exquisite. The Junior League does everything right. But my mom, although she came from New York City, her family came from Virginia. They were Southerners. They were the Woodward family from Virginia, and she actually spent childhood in Richmond, and the Woodwards were plantation owners. So it's really, in many ways, it feels like a homecoming being in the South, being in this location, former plantation land. And also as a writer, people have compared this book a lot to Garcia Marquez and his work. And it's interesting to me because Garcia Marquez and the writers who took part in the big explosion, what they call the boom of Latin American writing that began in 1967, gave credit to Southern fiction as the inspiration for Latin American fiction. Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, people like that, actually helped inspire what became the magic realist movement. So in some ways we're full circle. And of course it happens to be Cinco de Mayo. And I don't want to make anybody mad here, but a lot of people don't quite understand what happened in Cinco de Mayo. The French were, of course, defeated by the Mexicans in a battle. However, a lot of people don't know that the French were marching up here to help the Confederacy and got whooped. And, Grant made his march, so don't be mad at me. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this book and maybe read you a little bit of it so you get a sense of what it's like and who it's about and what the story has been for me to collect it and write it. And I thought if anybody wanted to chat, I would open it to questions or conversation if you would like to talk. I know there are a lot of issues. This is, of course, my most recent book. The last book was called The Devil's Highway, which was a book about immigration. It was a nonfiction story. Surprised me by being a finalist for the Pulitzer, which was heartening, not just because of being a writer, but because it was a book about people who had been disrespected and cast off and thrown away, and to see them recognized in their deaths like they had not been in their lives was really touching and moving to me. You talked about my interest in bearing witness. That came from working with missionaries. You might not notice it from the Hummingbirds Daughter because it's a little wild and woolly, but I used to work with a good missionary group of Baptists in Southern California. I was raised Catholic and was God crazy from an early age. But around college, I decided I was smarter than God and became a collegiate atheist like so many of us do. And I was introduced to a pastor in San Diego who worked in Tijuana with the poor, and I had been invited to go see the work in Mexico with him. And it struck me as insulting because, of course, I was from Tijuana. I was born in Tijuana. My family had been there 70 years or more. So I was a little arrogant about it. And but out of curiosity, I went. And he took me to places that I had never seen. People from Tijuana had never seen it. People didn't know that people were living in the Tijuana garbage dump, that they were living off the garbage, that they were eating dogs to survive, only 10 minutes away from downtown San Diego, which, of course, is the richest city and the richest half of the richest state and the richest country in the world. And there were days in the municipal garbage dump there when the city would bring run-over animals, dogs, cats, cows, horses, goats, whatever, and they would pile them up and burn them. And the spot where they burned these animals was also the most beautiful view spot from which you could look into San Diego, beyond the Border Patrol and beyond the dry hills, all the way to the ocean. And I realized at that moment that's why people are going to never stop coming. And so I kind of made a deal with God. I told God, I will tell their story first. Before I pursue my career, I'll try to tell their story first. Which was in some ways suicidal because nobody cared. When I started doing that, there were no border books. And I was rejected for 10 years straight, the book that I finally wrote. It was rejected over and over by every major publisher in the country. During that process, I was miraculously hired to teach writing at Harvard. I can tell you that I would have never gone to Harvard as a student. It was my mother's dream that I would go to Harvard. My mom from the Woodwards was perhaps the only Victorian lady in the barrio in which I grew up. She was the only woman who called people dear boy and dear girl, wore white gloves and a veil, had demi-tasse cups, and would read Dickens to me at night when I went to bed. Couldn't understand a word of it, but I thought this is so intoxicating. It kind of made me drunk on language. And when she left Dickens and went over to Mark Twain, then I was really there, Tom Sawyer especially. So I got this job, and the way I got the job was I was doing the missionary work, and I was the translator. And when you have that gift of being able to speak for people, you have the responsibility to listen. And that's what my training became, is listening to all the stories of all the people who nobody would listen to, because I had to tell people. I would have to tell doctors, or I would have to tell preachers, or I would have to tell cops, or I would have to tell army men. So if there was a medical exam, I had to do it, because I had to translate for the doctor. If there was a funeral, I had to do it. If there was a shooting or a stabbing or a burning or some other terrible thing, I had to deal with it. Just a light example of what that was like is that periodically the Mexican government will shut down the garbage dumps and stop people from working there, and they will station soldiers there with weapons, machine guns and stuff, and they will shoot you for breaking the line. And this pastor is quite fearless and has not only faith in God, but faith in chocolate donuts. And he took us in there, drove right past the machine gun emplacement, and then called me and said, "Hey, Luis, take those soldiers some chocolate donuts and get them to let us do the work." So I went up there with a bag of chocolate donuts and a 6-pack of Coca-Cola, and they turned their machine guns on me. And, it was this really bizarre standoff where chocolate versus weaponry. But chocolate won out. Of course, I wouldn't be here. So I was overwhelmed with this experience of the border. And I wrote to a friend of mine who was at Harvard. He had been my writing professor. I don't know if you're this kind of writing professor, but he was one of those former kind of hippie guys with love beads, and he would drum sometimes during class. Or one time during our writing workshop, he climbed up on the table and went to sleep in the middle of class. And to me, this was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I thought that was... So he had gone off to Harvard. I did not realize he was second in command of the writing program. And I wrote to him in the midst of the most violent, awful session of this work in Tijuana, and I said, "Could you get me a job? I need to get a job, and I need to get out of here, because my mind is reeling and I can't take it anymore. Would you get me a job as a janitor?" I said, "I will come, I will clean classrooms, I will, clean boards, whatever it takes, just for a few months to get myself back in balance." And he wrote and he said, "I think I can get you a job." He said, "But you have to send me 3 published pieces from lit journals." And I thought, being a California hick, that to be a janitor at Harvard, you had to be a published poet. So I told all my pals, at Harvard, because I was an expert, you have to be a published writer to be a custodian. Which wasn't the case. I was hired to go teach writing, which was a miracle. When I got there, I found the first book about this woman who I call the Hummingbirds Daughter in this novel. I didn't know she really existed. I knew her as a family legend. I knew her as stories. I'm sure you have stories similar to hers in ways. Everywhere I've gone, I've asked people, do you have a relative or an ancestor who supposedly could heal a wart, or could, get the cows to do something, or could, conjure up a ghost or whatever. We always have these people very close to us in our family histories. But in Mexico, those stories are a little more gruesome and crazy, and And I was telling the junior league down in Richmond that the way I first heard about this woman I wrote this novel about was through my family. We would have these gatherings in Tijuana. We lived at our grandma's house where we used to live when I was little. It was on a dirt street above downtown Tijuana. And we would come home for Christmas, and they had a kerosene heater. They would fill it with kerosene and light it, and it would make this whooshing noise, kind of a sound. And it cast these orange rippling lights from the flames in this dark room. And we would all gather. And I had an aunt, this really kind of scary aunt that we called La Flaca, which means, the skinny woman. And La Flaca was really kind of cranky, and she was very skinny, and she had the big cat eyeglasses, that went up like this and had glitter in them. She was blind in one eye because she had diabetes, so she had one eye like that. And she always smoked, and she liked Benson and Hedges 100s because it had more tobacco. And she'd tell us these stories, which for her were Christmas stories, The one I told them, one of the ones that sticks in my mind, is this story. She'd gather us, and all this light sort of rippling up on her face, and we'd be in the dark, these little kids, and she'd say, "You know what? One time, your abuelo, your grandfather, was riding his horse in Sinaloa, and he was going past the cemetery, and he saw a beautiful girl standing by the cemetery, and he said, 'Oye, do you want to ride on my horse?' And the girl said, 'Yes, I sure do.' So he said, 'Get up here.' And he helped her up on the horse, and he went riding along. It was around midnight. He decided to turn around and say something to her. And he turned his head, and the girl had turned into a skeleton with big fangs that was trying to suck his blood. And then she'd say things like, 'Merry Christmas.'" So, La Flaca, that was our Christmas story. So in the midst of those kind of stories, she started telling us about this aunt. "Tienen una tía yaqui y puede volar." Yeah, yaqui Indian aunt. She can fly. We'd be like, wow, yeah, she can raise the dead, she can heal the sick, and all this stuff, So in the collection of stories, that just became one chapter, and we all thought it may be true, maybe bunk, we didn't know. The stories got more elaborate. Over the years, the story became that she had died sometime during the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and that she sat on a crystal throne in a cave in the mountains, and her body was incorruptible. It had never rotted, but her clothing rotted and came off. But the Yaqui people had put warriors in the cave who spent their entire lives guarding the body, and when the clothes went bad, they redressed her, and that they would kill you if you went there. It's pretty heady stuff, I had later found an article about her to my great shock and realized that she really had been real. Carrie McWilliams' book, North from Mexico, has a chapter about her. I could not believe it. It was the first time I'd seen her name. Nobody knew her name. It was Teresita Urrea. So anyway, I go off to Harvard. I'm having this amazing time in Harvard. And I'm walking around looking at stuff I've never seen before. I don't understand the English they speak over in Boston. Water fountains are bubblers. Good things are wicked pisser. I thought, what does that mean? The corner shop is a spa, and sodas are tonics. So my first night there, the guy said, "Go down to the spa and get some tonic." And I thought, I'm going to the gym to get some vegetable juice? I didn't know what I was doing. But in the time I was there, I went to lots of bookstores, of course, and I was in a used bookstore, and I pulled a book called Teresita off the shelf, and it happened to be the first book I ever saw completely about this woman. So I began to research her seriously in 1985, beginning in Harvard. You can't get any better than the Harvard libraries. So I started working on her in Harvard, and I traveled all over the country collecting information and data and doing interviews and hitting historical societies and microfilm labs and all this sort of thing to get her story. And in 1995, after 10 years of book learning, I decided to experience more and go to Tucson, Arizona, which is the center where the North American Yaqui tribe lives. There's a Mexican tribe and North American tribe. I thought I'd get closer to those people and try to learn something. And I went down there, and I met family I didn't know I had. 2 branches of the family. One of the branches is Apache. The other branch is actually Yaqui and Mayo, who's the related tribe that are in this book. And in that Yaqui Mayo family, one of my cousins is a medicine woman, granddaughter of a medicine woman. So I began this whole other era of education where people who actually do the magic and actually do the healings and the herbalism started taking me in and teaching me stuff for this book. So that took up the next 10 years. That's how I ended up researching this for 20. And this is it. It's being made into a film. In fact, the director just wrote to us that he's at the Cannes Film Festival in a yacht. And I was like, well, thanks for inviting us, man, you know. I also met my wife, by the way, in Tucson, which was one of the blessings of the Hummingbirds Daughter, definitely. And if you're interested in the story, when we're done talking, you know, the people in the book are real. And we have photographs of Tomas and Teresita we've made into cards. So my wife, right there, Cindy, there she is. She has some of those cards. If you'd like them, we'll give them to you free of charge. There's a lot of people like that connection with those people. So let me tell you briefly what her story was. She was born in 1873 in a hacienda in Ocoroni, Sinaloa. She was the daughter of Tomas Urrea, my ancestor. Tomas Urrea, for you genealogists, was the first cousin of my great-grandfather, Don Seferino Urrea. He was orphaned at an early age, so he grew up with Seferino as his brother in his home. Tomas was a tall, handsome man. The ranch workers used to call him El Rascacielos. In Sinaloa, people have a lot of nicknames. Rascacielos means sky scratcher, because he was so tall. There's a guy I met, descended of some of the people in this book, whose name is El Quemapueblos, which means, you know, the man who burns down cities, which to me is the coolest nickname ever. And when you meet him, he seems like he's going to burn down a city, so it's kind of scary to talk to him. But El Rascacielos was her father. She was the illegitimate daughter. Her mother left the ranch in fear, essentially, that she was going to be a part of a scandal, and many horrors were erupting in northern Mexico. The government was moving against the Yaqui people and exterminating whole villages and so forth. So she disappeared and left Teresita with an abusive aunt who beat her and was cruel to her. And she was very interested in studying herbs and techniques to be a midwife and healing. And she came under the tutelage of an old medicine woman whose name was Huila. Huila means flaca, like my aunt, skinny woman. Huila was the head midwife and hechicera, curandera of the ranch, who did all the healings, but she was also the head of the domestic staff. So she lived in the main house with Tomas Urrea in her own room. So she was a figure of reverence and power. And one of the interesting things is that I don't have any records of her. The Mexican historians ignore her except to mention her. So one of the blessings of having this cousin who was a granddaughter of a Mayo medicine woman was that she taught me all the things Huila would have taught Teresita. So all the stuff you read in the book about miracles and healing and so forth, it's all true stuff, all research stuff, all chronicled stuff. People keep calling it magic realism and likening it to Garcia Marquez, but it's not. The magic stuff in this is not the fiction. The fiction is, what did you eat for breakfast, and what did your house look like, and what pants do you wear? It's the connective tissues, but all of the events in here, which are pretty extraordinary, are actually things that have been witnessed and written about in government reports, military reports, letters, eyewitness interviews, journalism, New York Times, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, San Francisco Chronicle, Mexico City newspapers. Huila began to train her. And at her early teens, she discovered the gift of taking away physical pain during childbirth. She could move her hand over the belly of a woman in labor and the pain would disappear. In fact, the women said it felt like hot honey poured over them and took away the pain. This made her extremely popular, extremely well known. And she worked quite hard and quite often doing this work. Tomás Urrea, for whatever reason, accepted her as his daughter when he realized who she was. Instead of rejecting her and casting her out, he took her in. So at the same time she was getting an indigenous education in all the herbs and all the stuff, she got a Western education too. She learned to read and to write and to dress, in nicer clothes and have all the fine junior league kind of details. So I don't want to give away everything in the book, but she had a near-death experience, I'll put it that way, in her teens. And when she came back from this near-death experience, according to the witnesses, her body began to exude the scent of roses. And when it began to exude the scent of roses, she suddenly had the gift of touch healing. Reports at the time say that they had a permanent encampment of over 10,000 people come down to the ranch to be near her. Pilgrims, followers, Indians, bandits, rebels, soldiers, Americans, Europeans. They flocked to her around the clock, hoping for a cure. The Mexican government got wind of this and sent the army out to stop it. And this led to massacres and warfare. And she was sent to the United States to get her out of Mexico. They called her the Mexican Joan of Arc. And Porfirio Diaz was afraid that she would ignite the revolution. She was called the most dangerous girl in Mexico by official decree and sent to Arizona, which is a pattern that's still happening today, I guess. But that's what she went. And she ended up in El Paso, and from El Paso went to San Francisco, St. Louis, New York City. That's in the next book. This all takes place in Mexico. But that gives you a little brief idea of who she was and what her story is. So I thought I would read you a little passage just to give you an idea of what she was like and what her experiences were like. And since we're here in the Hurt Plantation land, I thought I would read you a little thing about what it was like for a yard employee who inadvertently enters the house. She could have gotten, of course, in serious trouble for this, but Don Tomas had mercy. And then after I'm done, if you'd like to chat, I'll answer anything I can. If you want to talk about this or immigration or have questions about stuff, I'm more interested in hearing what you might want to say than lecturing you. But I thought I would preface this by giving you a little idea of how her personal powers began to exert themselves. So there's a little section about how, as a little girl, she would go to sleep, and then we'll go into her house. She's just realizing, by the way, that Tomas fascinates her. She doesn't know that he's her dad, and he doesn't know that she's his daughter yet. This is how she would go to sleep at night. Teresita had learned to put her body to sleep at night. Her smacks and bruises ached when she lay down. Tia, her aunt, liked to spank her, and she wasn't shy about using the wooden spoon either. Teresita had to take charge of the uproarious parts of herself, too naughty to be quiet at bedtime. Each night, Teresita would concentrate first on her feet, tired and sore from walking on rocks all day. She would order them, feet, go to sleep. Feet were the least of her problems. You can always get your feet to go to sleep. She could feel a golden glow come over her toes and spread to her heels, and the pain would be replaced by the soft tingle of sleep. Once the feet were becalmed, she could bring the glow up her legs, smoothing it like cream over her sore spots. Legs, go to sleep. And the legs too would sleep. Hips, belly, go to sleep. And now the glow was inside her, warm as a full meal, heavy in her gut, and it throbbed a little with her heartbeat. She would go this way up herself and down her arms. It was the hands that caused the most trouble, those bad twins, always inciting each other to misbehave. She would have to be cross with them and scold them a little to get them to stop fidgeting and plucking and scratching. Hands, I told you to go to sleep. The hands were such a task that she fell asleep soon after they did, tired and happily numb. Now Teresita is harassing her aunt about who am I. She realizes she doesn't look like the Indian kids. She doesn't look like the mestizo white kids. Who am I? Nobody knows. Her mom's not there. And she keeps bothering her aunt. And her aunt's fed up with her and tired of her asking. And Teresita's been talking obsessively about Huila, this great character. So her aunt finally says, stop bothering me. If you want to know who you are, go find your friend Huila and ask her. So Teresita innocently sets out to ask. On the day when Teresita set out to discover who she was, she by chance went to the same fruit tree her own mother had once leaned against. Teresita's hands went to the spots below where her mother had gripped the trunk, and she looked out at the same corral where Tomas was perched atop the same rail with the same cowboys. Segundo, his second in command, was breaking a nasty little bronco, and the boys were laughing and shouting and waving their hats at the horse when it got too close to the fence. Above Teresita's head, furious cicadas assaulted the high branches of the fruit trees, fondling the fuzzy globes. The next development in the day announced itself with a hiss. Psst! At first, she thought Tia had discovered her and was hissing at her. But she looked over by the trough, and a gray cowboy hat crown appeared over the edge of the water. It looked as if the hat was floating along by itself, or being held aloft by a ghost. "Hey," the hat said. "What?" A freckled face atop a gangly neck appeared beneath the hat, now revealed to be ridiculously large on the boy's head. It looked at Teresa as if his jug ears were the only thing keeping the hat from falling to his chin. The boy nodded at her once, then cut his head toward the corral, then made some kind of O shape with his mouth. "What?" she repeated. The kid wiggled his eyebrows, then jutted his chin at the corral. She sniffed dismissively and moved back around to her side of the tree. What a strange and rude boy. She wanted to look at Don Tomas again. Don Tomas had never spoken to her, but he did wink at her once when she was walking to church. "Oye tú!" "What?" "Girl!" She looked around the tree trunk. The boy's head rose and fell, the hat casting reflection on the green water of the trough. He looked like some kind of puppet show. "Is that him?" he said. "Him? Is that him? Him. You know, the sky scratcher." "It is," she said. "I knew it." The boy turned his eyes back to Tomas and stared raptly. Teresita had never seen a look like that. She decided to investigate. She walked over to the trough and squatted beside him and nudged him with her elbow. "Hey," he said, "watch it." He moved an inch away from her. "You don't live here," she said. "Hell no. I don't live anywhere." "Ocoroni?" "Nope." He spit. "You mean you're just wild?" She loved him. "That's right," he sneered. "I'm wild, like the Broncos. Don't forget it." They watched the cowboys together. "Why are you here?" she finally said. "Him. Urrea." He put a twig in his mouth like a cigarette. "He's my father." "No." "Yes." "No. Don't be stupid." Teresita looked back at Tomas. He kicked one leg over the top of the rail and jumped down, landing with his arms in the air and bowing as the vaqueros applauded. "Ahora, chavos," he announced, "I am going to my little house for a little bottle of beer and some sweet little kisses from the little lips of my little wife." The boys whistled at Tomas as he walked away. Teresita said to the skinny kid in the hat, "You stay here." 50 yards ahead of her, Tomas was diminished in perspective. He looked like a doll. She held up her hand and imagined herself holding him up. Tomas had worry leaking out from under his hat like smoke. He went to the house, trotted up the steps, and went in the front door. Teresita knew she was not allowed to follow. She knew that a field worker caught inside the house would be in real trouble, but she was not there to steal anything. She would simply go in the door and call for him, and when he came, she would tell him she needed to talk to Huila. She put her bare foot on the first step and tried it. It seemed solid enough. The only steps she had ever climbed were the solid stone stairs of the church. She stepped up and was on the porch without incident. She was amazed by the technology of a doorknob. It was clearly a fine object, a thing of shining brass and an egg shape made of some white substance. Could have been an egg. She grabbed the doorknob and pulled, and nothing happened. She pushed. She tried turning it, and there was a click that alarmed her at first, but then the door seemed to open of its own volition, and she followed it as it swung inward, its greasy hinges silent and fluid. She was amazed to see that the patron didn't have a dirt floor. And she stood fascinated by the wood planks under her feet. In the village, the really good housekeepers sprinkled lemon juice to wet down the ground, the dust, and make everything smell fresh. But this floor was beyond any juice. It shone as if there were a thin flood of creek water upon it. And there was perfume in the air, not lemons. Teresa slid the door shut and took inventory of the many fabulous objects before her. She did not know what the white people called fluttering white things that hung in the windows, but they were gauzy, and she could see light through them as if they had been made of moth wings or ashes. The walls were white. Pale green geckos moved across them and vanished behind a series of framed paintings of burros. She reached out her foot and touched a thick carpet. Teresita had never felt anything like it. She stepped onto it and sank her toes into its plush surface. Gold and red designs twined their way around its edges, and its rich blue had roses and vines somehow woven into it. A muted heartbeat arrested her attention. She looked around for the source of the sound, and she saw a tall wooden tower in one corner, and it had a narrow glass door, and a swinging gold pendulum flashed inside. She walked to this strange tree and looked up at its face. The face was round, and across it a blue moon seemed to float, followed by a swirly yellow sun. She did not know numbers, so the icons on its face meant nothing to her. She put her hands upon the wood column and felt it ticking. She put her ear to it to listen to such a wondrous thing. Tomas, at that instant, came hurrying out of his office. He was waving a letter of credit over his head, already starting to call out for someone to fetch his helpers, and remembering that his spurs were still on and his wife did not allow spurs in the house, when he skidded to a halt and beheld Teresita in Congress with his big clock. "How in the devil did you get in here?" he demanded. She looked at him serenely. "I followed you." She turned back to the clock. "This tree has a heart," she said. He blinked and looked a little more closely. He knew he'd seen her before. If his wife saw these dirty feet on the rug, well, what, might I ask, are you doing? He said. "I have been talking to this tree, but it won't answer me." He laughed. He stepped up to the clock and looked at it. "I suppose you're right," he said. "It won't answer you." "It must be a very rude tree," she said. "Yeah, clocks are rude. You know, this is a clock," she said. "This is a clock," he said. "It is. It's a grandfather clock." She seemed delighted by this information. He thought he should have her whipped or something, but he reached into his vest pocket instead. He didn't know why. "Look here," he said. He pulled out his pocket watch and clicked it open. It played a small bit of Mozart. She gasped. "It is the grandson clock," Teresita said. He laughed once more. "Make music again." He clicked it shut and reopened it. "Be careful," she warned. "When it grows big like the grandfather, it won't fit in your pocket anymore." With an amusing little creature, Tomas thought. Teresita looked around the room. "Patron," she said. "Yes." "Where do you keep your chickens?" chickens. They sleep in the hen house. Your chickens have their own house? She whispered. He called out to the help. Ladies? A harried woman stormed out of the hall and cried, Si, senor. This young lady, he said, seems to have wandered into the house by mistake. Could you fetch her a cool glass of juice, then see her out? The maid goggled at Teresita. I like juice, Teresita said. Well, it looks like this is your lucky day, said the patron. The maid stepped forward to grab Teresita. Sir, Teresita said. He looked at her. Does Huila live here? He bent to her and said, Huila? What do you want with Huila? I need to ask her something. He squatted before her, careful not to impale his buttocks with the starry rowels of his spurs. What do you need to ask her? I don't know who I am, Teresita said. Tomas stared into the face of this strange little girl. Then he looked over at the maid. Then he looked back at Teresita. What's your name? He asked. Teresa. All right, Teresita, he said, rising. Let's go find Huila. Let's find out who you are. He took her hand and led her down the hall toward the kitchen. And she said, do you have any cookies? I like cookies. But that's the first day they meet, so thanks. Thank you. So he realizes who she is and ends up taking her in, and she disrupts his life completely, of course. You know, by the end of the story, they are captured by the Mexican army, and all kinds of terrible things happen. So he lost everything for love of her. And one of the things Tomas did, which shocked everyone, aside from taking her in, was at a certain point, the ranch was attacked by Yaqui warriors, and they destroyed the entire ranch. In fact, he had to leave the state of Sinaloa and take a Lonesome Dove-style cattle drive north into Sonora. He was the first man to bring domesticated bees into Sonora. And when they got there, the Yaquis had burned down the ranch. And instead of going and killing them for doing it, he rode out alone and sought out the village and discussed with the people why they did it. And they told him why. You know, we're being killed, we're starving, we're being persecuted. So he made a deal with that village of Yaqui people that he would give them 10% of everything the ranch produced every year so that they would always have food, and that he would protect them when they came on the ranch. So, you know, he was quite progressive in his ideas. Nobody quite knows what inspired him to do that, but he did it. So he was a good man. Anyway, anybody would like to chat? I would chat with anyone. If you got any questions or comments? Yes.
I assume that all of your books are in English.
Yes.
Do you write in Spanish also?
I write poetry in Spanish, and I was just Mark and I were doing an interview before this about this. You know, I first spoke Spanish because we lived in that little colonia in Tijuana, and my mom would go to San Diego to work. She was the only English speaker. So I would spend the day, you know, with my grandma and with the girls who came to wash dishes or whatever, and my aunts, among them La Flaca, I told you about. So I picked up Spanish first, but it was a very impoverished neighborhood, and there was a lot of disease and so forth, and I ended up with tuberculosis, scarlatina, and German measles all at the same time, and just about died, and they decided they'd better get out of Tijuana, so they moved to San Diego. I was born as an American citizen born abroad. All that to say that, of course, all of my education was in English, and English is what I write in and what I, you know, felt like I tried to master. When I wrote this book, I tried to write it, though, as a kind of a magic trick in which it would sound like Spanish, and it would have a Spanish feeling to it. And I was trying to capture the Spanish of my dad and my uncles from Sinaloa. We're from a little town called Rosario, Sinaloa, originally. And there's a very particular language. We're a very particular people down there. For example, you know, my coloration always throws people because they always say, you don't look like a Mexican. The Mexicans always say, you don't sound like an American. So it goes both ways. One's visual, one's auditory. But in my dad's village, you know, the Urrea family is actually Basque. Urrea means men of gold in Basque. But my grandma was Irish. Her name was Guadalupe Murray. So I'm a Murray. And my uncle was Carlos Hubbard. So, we're this strange mix. But I was trying to catch that sound of how Carlos Hubbard and my father, who was named Don Alberto, by the way, spoke. So I wrote this book. And the Spaniards bought it for release in Spain. But they were going to translate it into proper Castellano, proper Spanish. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be insane because it's not going to be the same book at all. So Little Brown thought, well, let's put it out in Mexican Spanish. So I thought, well, first of all, I don't think I have the time or the energy to do this translation, but I can try. And I was a little worried about capturing this essence. And I have a cousin, Enrique Hubbard Urrea, who's a Mexican ambassador and a pretty good writer. He writes law books and things and memoirs. So I wrote to him and I told him my quandary. And he said, pues, let me try. Let me put it in Sinaloas. And this guy translated the whole thing. And then he sent it to me so that I could correct his translation and we could hash out. And I was appalled because it's better in Spanish than it is in English. So that's coming out right away. There's a big rush. I can't tell you why, but something big's happened for the book. And so it was going to come out in April 2007, but now it's coming out in Spanish. And I was going to vet it, but I just said, you're a genius, man. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. So I've had to translate all the other materials, like the paperback has added essays and questions and interviews, and I've had to do all that kind of stuff for them. But Enrique did the actual text. So that'll be out, I think, probably by summer. And then it's coming out in Hebrew, Turkish, German, French, Italian. I think it might come out in Icelandic, which will be really cool. I'm really looking forward to that. And it just won an Asian prize. I'm very happy about it. It's the first time a non-Asian book's ever won this award, the Kiriyama Prize for the entire Pacific Rim. And I'm hoping that it comes out in Japanese. I would love to see it in Japanese or Chinese now that the Kiriyama has happened. So all that to say that English is my primary thing, but I was dreaming it up in Spanish and doing all my investigations in Spanish. So, and it's funny, when I'm in Mexico, then I start writing in Spanish more. There's this weird little moment where if you're in Mexico about 2 weeks, you start dreaming in Spanish, and I've clicked over. I get my accent back, I start talking like my brothers do. My dad, who was very obsessed with losing his accent, but he never did, he would always say, Luis, do you note any accent when I speak? And I'd say, no, Dad. Sounds just like James Bond. Oh, stubborn. Yes.
You researched for 20 years. When did you actually start writing? How did the writing process?
I kicked around writings about it all 20 years, but I don't think I was really serious, And then I couldn't figure out if I was going to write it as a history book or as a novel. And, it just occurred to me that I felt that a novel would bring you much closer to everybody's soul. And I did version after version, and dealing with the shaman types, the spirits were messing with me a lot. And there were a couple of times when I would turn on the computer in the morning and the entire book would be gone. Everything, not a trace. That happened a couple of times. And I thought, leave me alone. You start sounding like you're crazy, But this final version, this is the first time I've been happy with it. Cindy says, it was the first time she'd ever seen me smile about it because it was such torture trying to find the way to, because the responsibility, you think, well, I don't want to misrepresent Teresita, and I don't want to misrepresent the family, and I don't want to misrepresent the tribe, and I don't want to misrepresent the healer women, and then Mexico, and then, after a while, if you worry too much, you just stop completely, so. But I'd say I probably worked on it as a writing project the last 5 years mostly. Really trying to hack at it. Yes?
Did you say there was going to be a sequel?
Yes, there's a sequel. This book ends, halfway through her life. And when she came to the United States, she had all these other wild experiences. So I'm going to be writing the sequel. I've actually signed the contract for it. I've signed a 2-book contract, but one of them has to be the sequel for this. So.
What about a movie?
The movie is on. Yes, it's been bought. It's good director. I'm leery of speaking about it because we haven't gotten the contract signed yet. But the director is, like I said, he's at the Cannes Film Festival this week getting funding. He's casting it already. He has an excellent screenwriter working with him. And he and I have become pretty good friends. He's a Mexican director who's made some pretty big films in the United States. It's funny because he's got bright red hair, freckles, and green eyes. And, he came looking for me at a reading in Beverly Hills, and we're both looking around for the Mexican guy. We totally missed each other. He's quite a gentleman. He's quite a pleasant guy because I inadvertently insulted him when I first spoke to him because he called me and we had a nice talk, and he said, "Who do you imagine as these characters?" Because he has all these thoughts about who should play who in the book. And he said, "Who should play Teresita?" And I said, thinking I was being funny, "Anybody but Jennifer Lopez." And he had just made a Jennifer Lopez movie. And he's like, no, not J-Lo, no. And then I found out the next day, but he didn't take it to heart. He's very good about it. So there's, they're pursuing cast and all that, and because he loves the story so much, and because it's my family story, of course, they'll tell you anything in Hollywood, but he's promising me to work hand in hand with me. He wants me to help him see what people look like and, what actions happen. And he keeps saying, "I want you beside my camera when I direct." We'll see how long that lasts. But that would be very nice if that's true. Yes?
When did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
When did I know I wanted to be a writer? I wanted to do anything having to do with art, no matter what it was. I probably wanted to be a rock star, let's face it, I was a kid in Southern California, and all of my friends were going to be rock stars, so heck, I could be a rock star too, I thought. And but I was pretty skilled at graphic arts, and I was an actor. I was actually originally a drama major. I switched over to writing. But I loved reading. I was a reading maniac, and I would read, I was that kid that flashlight under the blanket guy, And I got really fascinated with words and with poetry especially. Poetry was though I loved reading science fiction and crazy books and stuff, poetry did something to me when I was a kid. And, I've told this story before, but I was a mediocre student. I was a distracted student, and I didn't enjoy poetry when I was in middle school. I didn't really get it. We were reading things like John Greenleaf Whittier and things like that. I just didn't understand what was happening. Longfellow and Wordsworth, and I didn't know what was happening. And an English teacher, in exasperation, said, if you don't like this stuff, you should go read Stephen Crane. And I thought he meant Red Badge of Courage. And I was like, we already read it, and I didn't get that either. And he said, no, Stephen Crane's poetry. Just go, I promise you, just go get his poetry. So I went to the library, and I got Stephen Crane's poetry, and it was this revelation. It changed my life, It was the first time I'd read blank verse. It was the first time I'd read things so sort of dark and crazy. They were very twisted, and they were really tiny. And I thought, wait a minute, you can write really tiny poems? How cool is that? So I started doing that, and I would take my allowance to the bookstore to buy books. And so after my Stephen Crane revelation, I went to the bookstore, and this is an embarrassing epiphany I'm going to share with you, but this is what happened. I went in this bookstore, and I was looking at the poetry section, and I saw a book by Jim Morrison of The Doors. And I thought, whoa, Jim Morrison has a book. And I went over there, and next to it was Bob Dylan's book, Tarantula. And next to that was Leonard Cohen's collected poems, Spicebox of the Earth. And next to that was John Lennon's Spaniard in the Works and Skywriting by Word of Mouth. And it was like, it was like the heavens opened up and angels sang, because I realized that these rock stars were writers, that Bob Dylan's songs didn't just happen, but he wrote them. And Jim Morrison, who I thought I was going to be one day, wrote this stuff. He wrote poems. And I opened his book, and they were shorter than Stephen Crane's poems, which was really cool, you know. Some of the poems were 2 words long, but they were cryptic and mysterious, and it seemed like I'd found some weird magic. I mean, it's no accident, I think, that I ended up studying with shamans, because it was kind of an experience like that. I thought, this is going to transform the world. I've discovered magic. So then I started reading everything. My mom had a Rod McEwen collection from the Book of the Month Club. I grabbed all those Rod McEwen. I didn't know everybody didn't respect Rod McEwen. I just thought, what's magic, what he's doing? He has stuff broken up with numbers. I didn't understand any of the technique, but I copied everything. So that's how I got going. And I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And, you know, I found a typewriter in our garage, which was this revelation to me. And I put it in the kitchen, and I would type this stuff out. I went for this orgy of typing, and my mom figured it out pretty quickly, and she took my sheaf of typing paper and sewed it together, made a book. So I was published in my kitchen, you know. So it started early, you know, in my teens. And I just kept at it. It was the thing I ended up loving the most. And it kind of became central to my spiritual practice in life. It really did. I mean, you know, one of my friends used to kid with me that I practiced writing fu instead of kung fu, that you're a black belt in writing fu, which I thought was very funny until I found out that the oldest writing book in the world is a book called Wen Fu, which means writing fu. And the thing that really shook me was my nickname in Tijuana was Luchi, and the man who wrote his name Luchi, so I thought, whoa, you know, one of those shamanic coincidences. And I started reading Wen Fu, and the thing about the word Wen is it's one of the oldest known words in the world. It's from pre-civilization China. It's from the shamanic era, the tribal era of China. And Wen is a magical term for the summoning of spirits. And Wen became the word for writing, and the pictograph became the word written out for writing. So it fell into line with what I believed about it. So I read a lot of Asian writers and haiku poets and stuff too. So it just became a way of seeing the world for me and communing with whatever, the divine, I guess. Yes? Well, do you want to hear what I really think? First of all, politicians are making a lot of money off what's happening. Undocumented workers put $7 billion a year into Social Security, which they'll never get back. It's 10% of the surplus operating budget right now. Everybody knows it. Nobody tells you that. The numbers of how much they put into tax, state tax and federal tax, are staggering. Nobody can even guess at this point. The cost of making, quote, illegals, felons, rounding them up and putting them out of the country will be $121 billion a year. Hence, it ain't going to happen. When you go to the border and hang out with the Border Patrol, you find out they are ordered not to catch people. They are told when there's a lack of workers to let more workers in because we need more workers. Everybody knows it except the American people. So what I could go on for hours about the stuff I've learned. I will tell you, I don't know that you can build a moat. It would be interesting. People need work, It'd be like a WPA project, maybe. I will tell you that, I was telling Mark this earlier, I have a nephew who's undocumented, came across, paid a coyote. You know what he does for a living? Gardener for the Border Patrol. So, when I see people push for border reform, it makes me laugh a little bit because you can't reform something that has no policy whatsoever. It's total chaos. The Border Patrol agents will tell you, we're here to enforce federal law, but we don't. We enforce policy of whoever's the governor, whoever's the president, whoever's the station chief. Their hands are tied. Now, that's not to say Mexico isn't complicit, because Mexico is. The policies that we see afoot today of sending people north, were actually formalized at Harvard. John Kenneth Galbraith was one of the authors of the study that suggested that the way to preserve a third world country on the brink of revolution is to move the population that's rural through, sanctions and difficulties in survival into a neighboring first world country, which is exactly what happened. So in a lot of ways, it's hard for me to watch this argument because in a lot of ways I feel like we accidentally helped create it. And President Fox is no idiot. He has a really huge social problem. Just send it to the U.S. It's no longer a problem. And one of the things that's happening, I'm telling you this out of the words of people I'm close to in the Mexican government, one of the fears in Mexico is that this population will come home. I reject illegal immigration because the majority of the people I know or have worked with aren't coming here to be American citizens. They're coming here to work. They're coming here to be migrants. And one of the weird things that's happened on the border is that the stepped up border security, things like Operation Gatekeeper and all these things that we've put in the urban corridors, as you well know, have pushed people into the wilderness corridors, which are more dangerous, but they're also more prone to things like criminality, gang membership, and all that sort of stuff. But the journey has become so much more expensive, so much more dangerous, and so much more difficult that statistics are showing that people come and stay. That's why everybody's so visible, because people can't afford to keep trying to go back home. People still do, don't get me wrong, but the majority of the people aren't going home, and it's much easier to send remittance money home electronically through La Western than it is to go home. That's $17 billion a year going to Mexico, by the way. $45 billion a year going to Latin America and the Caribbean. But $17 billion going straight to Mexico. So that's kind of interesting to me. But the fear in Mexico is the population's getting to retirement age and will suddenly come home. And there's nothing in place to deal with the population that came here. One of the things the Fox administration tried to do to capitalize on all this was they came up with a thing called the 3-for-1 policy. And the 3-for-1 policy dictated that every American dollar that came in, first of all, they would all go through Banamex, the Mexican banking system, all of it, to organize it. And then federal government, state government, and city governments would put in $1 to match your dollar. And my politician relatives wrote and said, well, it's not as much money as you think because people didn't sign up. And I was like, what self-respecting Mexicano is going to tell Mexico City how much money just came from? They're not going to report it. It's crazy. You wouldn't do it. All of those things are in play. There's a lot of stuff in play here. If you look at the proposal for border reform that's circulating right now in the Mexican government, it's kind of eerie because it's, of course, in Spanish, but it's almost point for point the same thing that McCain and Kennedy have proposed. It's astonishing to read. And I ask these guys, if both countries want the same thing, what's stopping it? That's what I can't figure. I can't get to what's stopping reform and a humane answer to this insanity. I can tell you that more and more people are dying. Last year, the number was at 518 in the Arizona desert. The Border Patrol does not pick up the bodies that don't have ID, so there's always at least 200 more dead than you know about, if not more. So I predict this year it's going to be around 800 or 1,000 lying dead, just trying to get here. The criminal act involved is a civil infraction. It's not even a misdemeanor. It's a civil infraction, which is a law about torts and agreements and contracts. It's a civil law. Speeding tickets are under civil law. It's not worth dying for. No question, it's not worth dying for. What I hate seeing is, the American workers getting burned. I understand people's sense of panic. We live in Naperville, Illinois. You can't get more white bread than that. And they have menudo on the shelves in the store. We went to Kankakee, Illinois, and I thought we were invited to do a reading in Kankakee at the library. And I thought there'd be about 20 librarians with some cookies. And we went down there and there were 350 people in there. The mayor came, gave me the key to the city, which is awesome. But they wanted to talk about this issue, and I thought, oh my God, it's in Kankakee, Illinois. We lived in Louisiana, and you drive through Arkansas, it's Mexican. I couldn't believe Arkansas. You go up in the hills in Arkansas above Purdue, and there's, templos del Evangelio, evangelical Mexican churches and stuff. So the paradigm is not shifting. I think the paradigm has shifted already. And I think we need to find a way to deal with it. I think one of the politicians from Mexico said, I think Americans are standing at a train station holding up signs saying stop, and the train already left and they don't know it. We're already here. So those things are happening. Now, there are questions of hope. I see a lot of hope in these border reform bills. I really do. I don't think the heavy metal ones are going to work. Our prisons have so much room that they would welcome 12 million more felons, right? It's not going. And then that would render things like the Catholic Church, the Presbyterians, the Unitarians, the Quakers, First Church of Christ, any missionary group, all of them open to felony. I don't think that can happen. But here's something that is happening. And this is something that gives me hope, believe it or not. And a lot of the politicians in Mexico were against this because they knew it was political suicide. But one of the things to keep the population in the United States and not coming back to Mexico was to open up voting from the United States in Mexican elections. Some of the wiser politicians said, no way, man, because border perestroika is going to get those guys, and they're going to start voting for more and more reform candidates. Get it? But people are nervous still to do it. But it's happening. The remittance money going home is not just for, Tío Pancho to get a nicer house. Now people are targeting urban renewal projects. People are doing infrastructure repair. There are action committees, like in Chicago, there's guys from Michoacan, there's communities from different states and so forth. They're targeting jobs that the government couldn't or wouldn't do. Work on that, work on this. They're putting in schools, they're putting in sidewalks, stop signs, all that kind of stuff, which is an amazing thing. There are investors in the United States that have a whole new plan. NAFTA didn't work. NAFTA went to China. It's working great for China and the Indian subcontinent right now, but all the factories that they built in Mexico are abandoned. In the year it took me to write The Devil's Highway, over 500 maquiladoras were abandoned. And those maquiladoras were magnets that helped attract people north. Then the jobs disappeared. Where are they going to go? You know where they went. They went to Burger King. That's where people went to work. But those maquiladoras were abandoned. But these investors are now have a whole new paradigm, which they're calling microeconomic zones, where they're targeting businesses and companies in Mexico, small scale, that are successful. And they're giving them management training, and they're investing micro investment and getting these companies up and running. And they're trying to network them all over the country. Now it's starting to happen agriculturally too. There's some agricultural projects the same. That gives me hope. Those empty factories are now going pretty cheap. So there are some homegrown Mexican companies who get to stroll into, the Vicks Vapor Rub factory and start work with so NAFTA is accidentally going to work backwards, maybe. That's happening. Another thing that's happening that sounds somewhat like a joke, but it isn't, is that there's big regions of Mexico devoid of men. And you're seeing a kind of a groundswell of female action. And I think female action is going to be a powerful thing for Mexico. Women taking political power because they have to. There's nobody else to do it. So women are organizing action committees and stuff like that. All that is happening. It's an amazing thing to watch. And, all even to levels that I find funny, like Baja California has got almost 1 million retired Southern Californians living in it now because it's cheap. I always tell people, when you get a retiree from San Diego or Orange County, they turn anywhere they go into Orange County. And that's what they're doing. By the year 2010, they're going to be well over 1 million living in Baja California. And, they've gone down there and they've raised holy hell. They want better plumbing. They want better streets. So suddenly everything's getting fixed up because these folks are demanding it and putting their money into it. So there's all this stuff going on both ways. It's actually rather hopeful. I didn't think there was any hope. I was depressed by the end of that last book because I thought, this is hell. It hurts me. It hurts seeing people suffer like this. It hurts watching what's going on both sides. But there's a lot of hope happening. Yeah, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to amass as much data as I can, free of inflammation on either side. I'll tell you this. Again, I was tell Mark this story, but I started book tour, well, I've been touring for a couple of weeks, but I was in Missouri early in the book tour, and I got to visit with Rush Limbaugh's family. And it was an amazing thing, Colonel John Limbaugh and Paulette Limbaugh. And I was like, you're like Limbaughs? Yes, we are, you know. And Colonel Limbaugh said to me, you know, talking about this last, the immigration book, he said, I thought you might have an agenda. And I started reading that book, I got 30 pages into it, and I thought, you don't have an agenda. And that really touched me, because it was really hard trying to be fair to everybody. And I said, you know, my agenda is to try to get at truth, because I am personally dying for lack of truth. I'm watching my country suffer for lack of truth, and I'm watching my other country suffer for lack of truth. So if we could get truth and try to understand it, that would make me very happy. Just figures that we don't hear about. And you know, the culmination of the Kankakee story that I got a little sidetracked on was that while I was talking to these 300 people, a hand went up in the back, and a guy stood up. And it was a Mexican guy, and he said, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of this book. He held it up. He said, you know why? He said, because now everybody here can understand what we went through so they could eat a salad tonight. And you watched it go through that room like a wave, this ripple of shock and recognition. And I didn't know how that was going to go over, you know. And when I got done talking and they stood up, they didn't come to me, they went to that guy. I was like, hey, wait, hey, you know. But they went to talk to him, and it was a really amazing thing. And you know, so theologically, I feel it very strongly, more than politically. Yes, sir.
Could I ask you to remember back that 10-year hiatus after you finished the book, before somebody finally took it up?
My first book?
Yeah.
Yes, it was called Across the Wire. You know, I kept journals when I was doing the work in the garbage dumps and so forth. And when I went to Boston, I took all these journals with me, and I had the pictures of the kids. And they would send me stuff from the orphanages and things, like my favorite taco stand in the world is in Tijuana, Tacos El Paisano. And the guy who was the taco chef was sort of the Bruce Lee of tacos. He was this Jackie Chan taco master. And he could chop the carne asada faster than any human being and throw the taco together, but he could also whip the salsa and guacamole over his shoulder and catch it in the taco. He was my hero. And he had this crazy voice. He would always yell, you know, "Otro taco!" Like that, right? And he'd see me coming down the street and he'd say, "Ahí viene el güerito!" You know? So they would go down knowing I loved him, and they would tape record this guy making tacos, and you'd hear, "Otro taco!" You know, and I'd listen for an hour and a half tape, and every once in a while he'd lean over to the tape recorder and say, "Güerito! Güerito! No está contestando!" He's not answering me. He thought it was like a radio, you know, or a phone. He's not saying anything. So I had all this stuff around me, and I was in this alien world of New England, and, you know, I had made this pact with God, so I wrote the first version, and I couldn't get an agent. So I rewrote it, and I got an agent, and he submitted it, and it got rejected by everybody, so he said, it's not going to work. So I took it back, I rewrote it, got rejected by everybody, I took it back, I rewrote it. Once a year I rewrote it. Nothing happened. 1990, my mother died, and I had to move back to California to take over the family home. And I started working for an alternative weekly newspaper. And I had called them looking for a job, and the editor said, do you have anything about Tijuana? And I said, well, just happen to have a book right here. And I gave it to him, and I did not know what I was letting myself in for, because those of you who work with newspapers know that newspaper editors are monsters. And he slaughtered me. But, you know, it was what I needed, somebody to take out all of my confusion and turn it into something that any Joe on the street could read and understand. And what happened was he took all of these pieces and we put together a long suite about what it was like to live in the Tijuana garbage dump with photographs, and they published it on the front page Thanksgiving week. And people in San Diego had never heard of what was happening there. You know, that Christmas, 14 babies died of cold in Tijuana. Nobody knows that. They think Southern California. What cold? But it's freezing cold up in those hills. So, you know, that was an amazing epoch for me. And I had given up on being a famous author, so I went to grad school. I thought, forget it. I'm going to go to grad school and teach English. And I went to Colorado, and this agent said, let me try it one last time. So I said, sure, try. Submit it one last time. He sent it to Anchor Books. And they asked me to give them 12 reasons why they should publish it, which I thought was kind of unfair to get a writer that way. So after 10 years of failure, I wrote things like, God wants you to, And what fell into my favor was other writers I had met over the years, and they were very supportive. And several writers wrote letters of support in. John Nichols, who wrote the Milagro Beanfield War, who now says he was drunk on whiskey that night, wrote a letter and said that he would go on tour for me and sign books for me. He's like, I wouldn't do that. I didn't think you would. But so they decided to publish it. And, it was one of those accidental, or maybe not accidental. It came out. They did it as a paperback original, paid me very little money, put it out in a very small edition, figuring, tax write-off. We did it for our spiritual good or whatever. And the New York Times Book Review did a gigantic full-page review with photographs, and it just went crazy. And here I am. It's in 18 printings now. So I used to be able to boast it got a printing for every year they wouldn't, but now I'm almost up to 2 printings for every year. So, but that's what it was like.
What is the title of the book again?
The first book's called Across the Wire. Yes, back there. This probably should be the last one. Oh, it's getting late. Sorry.
Two things. Do you usually go around schools also telling your stories and encouraging Hispanic kids
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
to start writing and getting more into other jobs other than McDonald's and whatever?
Son mi raza. I've got to do it, because nobody else will do it. I have to do it. I do go to a lot of schools and places. I go to jail sometimes. The Devil's Highway Tour started at New Mexico State Prison. I thought that was an interesting opening salvo. But, I like to do that. In fact, earlier in this tour, I was in El Paso, just to show you how crazy book tour is, and I was hanging out with Mexican luchadores, which was, the highest achievement of my life, I thought. I was with El Rey Escorpión y El Muñeco Infernal, the infernal he-doll. And they had their wrestling masks, and these guys were unbelievable. They were really cool, though. And so I brought home a bunch of wrestling masks, and I took them with me on the road, and we had them in Richmond, Virginia. You don't do wrestling masks with the junior league, but they took me to a school to talk to the high school kids, and the kids were they were friendly, but, so I busted out the masks, and they've turned out to be the greatest teaching tool with high school kids ever. Everybody, they put the mask on, and so, you have to do it. You have to talk to kids. If people hadn't given me a blessing early on, I wouldn't be here now. My being here with you is the most unlikely story on earth, and I know that. I still remember Tijuana, and so I'm thankful every day. But somebody has to reach out to the kids, and not just Hispanic kids. Somebody has to reach out to our kids, period. They need to know that it's okay. And I always ask, anybody here want to be a writer? And there'll be one person going, But they write to me through my website, or we do all kinds of stuff, And if I can, if it's local, I usually just go and hang out. If people have grant money, I charge the maximum the grant will pay, and then we use it to buy books so the kids can get the books. Because you figure, when are you going to meet a writer and get a signed book from them? So things like that. I think we've run out of time. They're getting antsy over here. Thank you very much. Very people for example, my great color always goes through people because they think the US look next to Mexico is you say I don't get like Americans. It's good. Those days when visual on a lot of but my dad is with the Freya family actually my but my grand